If a man smiles and quietly walks away from his first-class seat after being insulted, would you ever imagine that, just a few hours later, an entire airline corporation would be on its knees, begging him for forgiveness? That morning, on Apex Flight 247 inside the gleaming silver first-class cabin, Ethan Carter, the black CEO of NovaCore Technologies, was asked to give up his seat 1A to make room for a white executive named Victoria Hale. People stared, some with pity, others with smug satisfaction. What no one knew was that, inside Ethan's slim laptop, rested the control core of an $800 million system, the very heart of the airline's infrastructure. He said nothing. No argument, no raised voice, just a calm smile as he moved quietly to seat 18C, opened his laptop, and logged into the company's internal security network. Now, let me ask you this. If it were you publicly humiliated like that, would you explode in anger, or let justice take its own course? One simple click, one powerful lesson about dignity and power begins right here. Hit like, share, and subscribe, and join me in today's story, Black CEO Removed from First Class. One call later, Airline's 800-man freezes. The first-class cabin of Apex Flight 247 was almost silent that morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the silver airline logo and casting a soft reflection on the calm face of Ethan Carter, a 38-year-old black man in a simple gray suit and a classic wristwatch. No one in that cabin knew he was the CEO of NovaCore Technologies, the company behind the $800 million AI operating system, the technological heart of the very airline they were flying on. Ethan only wanted peace. He hated noise, especially the kind that came from meaningless arguments. He had faced prejudice more times than most, from boardrooms to international summits, and he'd learned that sometimes silence is the weapon people fear most. The ticket in his hand clearly read Seat 1A, First Class. He had booked it 4 weeks ago, a seat that should have meant nothing special. But today, it would become the center of a moral test. "Excuse me, sir," came the voice of Thomas Gray, the head flight attendant, soft but tight like a stretched wire. "Your seat needs to be reassigned to a priority passenger. A minor system issue." Ethan looked up. His eyes met the woman standing behind Thomas Victoria Hale, senior executive of Apex Airways. Her makeup was flawless, her gaze cold. She didn't speak at first, only offered a thin smile. "I'm sure you understand it's a small matter. I have to sit in 1A for internal coordination reasons." No one in the cabin said a word. Some passengers pretended to scroll through their phones. Others hid behind newspapers. It was a familiar silence, the kind that appears when people witness something wrong, but lack the courage to speak. Ethan placed his ticket on the table and exhaled slowly. If that's Apex policy. He stood without bitterness, without judgment in his eyes, just a man choosing to keep his dignity intact. He walked down the aisle to Site 18C, beside a young woman in a gray hoodie that read UX Matters. Her name tag said Sarah Lee. She looked at him, curiosity mixing with discomfort. "Did they move your seat?" "Yeah, seems that way," he replied quietly, opening his laptop and logging into NovaCore's internal management system. No one noticed the small red text flashing across his screen, Protocol Omega, standby mode, up front. Laughter broke out again. Victoria was chatting about the company's diversity policy. "I've always felt that people like them sometimes get chosen for their skin color, not their skill," she said, swirling her glass of white wine. Sarah heard it. She glanced at Ethan. He remained calm, fingers gliding across the keyboard. Some passengers began recording. Sarah sensed something shifting in the air as if his calmness was drawing the whole cabin toward him. Meanwhile, at Apex Airways headquarters in Chicago, red lights began flashing across the operations room. Baggage routing system is locked. AI scheduling unresponsive, no access to the main server. On the central monitor appeared a chilling message. Access denied. Protocol Omega active. Lydia Monroe, Apex's CEO, rushed in, her face pale. She'd met Ethan Carter at a strategic summit just last week. She'd described him as too calm, almost cold. Now, that very calmness was freezing her empire. "Get him on the line," Lydia snapped. "We can't, the plane's still in the air." At the same time, Twitter exploded with a video Sarah had just posted Ethan leaving his 1A seat. Victoria, setting her purse on it, captioned simply, "Sometimes silence is louder than anger." Within 2 hours, the hashtag Seat 1A was trending worldwide. CNN, BBC, Fox News, every outlet was asking, who is the black man on Apex Flight 247 back on the plane? Thomas received a priority message through his crew device. His face changed as he turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter, we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. The airline deeply values NovaCore's partnership." Ethan looked up, his voice low and steady. "I didn't realize a single seat required so much attention." The words were light as air, yet everyone in the cabin heard them. Phones lowered, conversations died. Victoria looked away, flustered. Thomas bowed his head. Ethan closed his laptop and looked out the window. Clouds drifted by like white streaks of memory, each one a reminder of how often people are judged by their color or by the seat they occupy. He murmured softly, only to himself, "Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs the right moment." In Chicago, Lydia Monroe stood in a war room of darkened screens. Apex stock was plummeting. Flights were grounded across the nation. An advisor whispered, "If we can't restore the system within 24 hours, we're facing at least $800 million in losses." A trembling executive asked, "Who has the authority to unlock it?" Lydia's reply came barely above a whisper. "Only Ethan Carter." Back in first class, as the plane began its descent, Thomas approached again, his voice cracking. "Mr. Carter, CEO Lydia Monroe would like to meet you immediately after landing. She wants to speak in person." Ethan met his gaze. "When they're ready to talk as equals," he said quietly, "I'll listen." A heavy silence filled the cabin. No one saw a downgraded passenger anymore. They saw a man who knew his worth. Power, they realized, doesn't come from where you sit. It comes from how you stand. As the plane touched down, Sarah turned to him. "I recorded everything. I hope you don't mind." Ethan smiled the calmest smile she had ever seen. "Not at all. Sometimes the truth just needs someone brave enough to hit record." But the story didn't end there. When the aircraft doors opened, the world outside had changed. Flashing cameras, buzzing reporters, and the voices of people who had once stayed silent now asking themselves whether they'd just witnessed an act of rebellion or a declaration of modern justice. Because to Ethan Carter, justice isn't a battle. It's simply the right choice made at the right moment. And when the world began to speak up, the only one who stayed silent was the man everyone had to listen to. The world only saw a black man in a suit sitting in first class, but few knew the story behind those calm eyes, the long journey of Ethan Carter, a man who had learned how to survive the kind of prejudice most people never have to think about. Ethan grew up in South Chicago, in a neighborhood where black kids dreamed not of fame, but simply of getting out. His father was an electrician, his mother a night shift nurse. They taught him one thing: knowledge is the one place no one can ever take from you. And maybe that's why Ethan chose science, not to prove anything to anyone, but to find peace in a world that never stopped talking about color. When he founded NovaCore Technologies, many saw it as just another startup run by a tech-savvy black guy. No one believed that. A few years later, his artificial intelligence system would become the backbone of multiple corporate giants, including Apex Airways, the same airline that had just asked him to give up his first-class seat. Ethan Carter, 38 tall, lean, with a deep, precise voice. He didn't like speaking loudly. He didn't need to. People paid attention to him not because he tried to impress them, but because he listened a rare kind of power in a world obsessed with being heard. Inside, though, he carried invisible scars. The Times investors had interrupted him mid-pitch. "You're really articulate, not something we often see in someone of your background." The meetings where people mistook him for his own assistant. He never reacted. He remembered, and he turned every slight, every smirk, into fuel to move forward. On Apex Flight 247, when it all happened, people saw a man quietly stand and walk away. But for Ethan, that moment wasn't humiliation. It was a mirror reflecting the system he once believed he had surpassed. When Thomas Gray, the chief attendant, asked him to move, Ethan didn't hate the man. He knew Thomas was just a product of a system built on the idea of who deserves first. When James Miller, the young flight attendant, offered him a polite, almost apologetic smile, Ethan saw it too, not hatred, but bias coded into courtesy. And Victoria Hale, the woman who took his seat, she represented a generation of privilege that never sees itself as privileged. She didn't hate black people, she simply never thought about them. That kind of indifference, Ethan knew, was the most dangerous form of prejudice. Then there was Sarah Lee, the young woman in the gray hoodie, the only one in the cabin who saw the story differently. When she opened her phone and started recording, it wasn't for clicks or fame, it was instinct, her conscience whispering, "This isn't right." Sarah had no idea who the man beside her was, but she could feel it. His calm made everything else in the world feel small. When her video went viral, it became more than a case of airline misconduct. It became a mirror forcing society to confront where real power lies, not in the seat you occupy, but in how you respond to injustice. At Apex Airways headquarters, Lydia Monroe, the powerful CEO, was in crisis mode. Lydia was the kind of leader who believed in procedure. She'd often said, "If we follow the system, fairness will follow." But this time, the system betrayed her. It turned her airline into a symbol of structured discrimination, and the man she'd shaken hands with just a week ago. Ethan Carter now held the digital switch that could freeze her $800 million empire. Ethan didn't activate Protocol Omega for revenge. He only wanted the system to pause long enough for them to look at themselves. It wasn't punishment, it was a lesson. He once told his team, "Justice isn't about hurting people. It's about reminding them what they've forgotten." On the plane, as whispers spread about the viral video, Ethan stared out the window. The sky was blanketed in clouds, sunlight flickering across the glass, and in that quiet moment, Memories of his parents came rushing back, two people who'd worked their whole lives just to teach him, don't fight anger with anger. Let your mind do the talking. He closed his eyes briefly. A thought crossed his mind soft. Certain, if the world needs to relearn fairness, maybe the first lesson should begin in the one place built to divide first class. Up front. Victoria Hale began to panic. She heard whispers about the video, about the name Ethan Carter. When the crew began murmuring, she pretended not to notice, though her hand trembled against her wine glass. Thomas Gray approached her quietly. "Ms. Hale, I think we should apologize to Mr. Carter." Why, she frowned. Because it seems he's not just an ordinary passenger. Victoria turned away without replying. But inside, her pride had started to crack. In row 18C, Sarah Lee's phone buzzed nonstop. Her video had passed 1 million views. One comment made her freeze. The man in the video is Ethan Carter, CEO of NovaCore. They just signed a contract with Apex last week. She turned toward him. He was still there, calm, quiet, as if none of it mattered. "You know your video's everywhere, right?" she asked softly. "I do," he said, eyes still on the clouds. "Fairness has its own way of spreading even when we don't speak." As the plane descended, the captain's voice came over the speakers. But inside the cabin, no one felt calm anymore. Thomas hurried toward Ethan, his voice trembling. "Carter, CEO Lydia Monroe wishes to meet you immediately after landing. They apologize for what happened." Ethan simply nodded. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I need change." He gently closed his laptop. The screen went dark, leaving only his reflection on the glass. A man who chose silence, yet made an entire system speak. And when the plane's wheels touched the ground, no one realized that impact would ignite a tremor, not just in aviation, but in how the world understands dignity and power. The world doesn't always need villains to be unjust. Sometimes, all it takes is a system convinced it's doing the right thing. When Flight Apex 247 touched down across the country inside a glass tower in downtown Chicago, Lydia Monroe, CEO of Apex Airways, stood in the middle of an emergency meeting. Flashing red text filled the internal screens. System Lockdown Protocol Omega activated. The airline's $800 million operational network had gone dark. No alerts, no software crash, just silence, the kind that only happens when power itself stops breathing. Lydia stared at the Apex logo engraved on the wall. For the first time in years, something stirred in her chest, a mix of wounded pride and a fear she didn't yet have words for. Apex Airways wasn't just an airline. It was an institution built on what they proudly called corporate priority, a web of privilege disguised as professionalism, a culture refined over decades. Everything in that system was predetermined: who sits where, who gets served first, and who is expected to understand their place without anyone having to say it aloud. The company's policies wore clean names: VIP protocols, operational priority, elegant masks for a truth no one wanted to face. Apex's order was built not on fairness, but on hierarchy. A hierarchy written in sterile, legal, corporate language cold enough to sound legitimate. And then, one routine seat reassignment shattered the illusion. The mask slipped, revealing the real face of privilege, arrogant, indifferent, and certain of its own righteousness. Lydia Monroe had always believed she was right. At 52, she was celebrated as a symbol of female leadership in a man's world. But somewhere along that climb, she'd absorbed the very systems she once fought against: control, favoritism, and the quiet conviction that her version of power was more moral than everyone else's. In her mind, Apex's model wasn't discriminatory, it was customer experience optimization. And in her definition, men like Ethan Carter, even as strategic partners, were still collaborators, never equals at the table. Downstairs, chaos ruled the operations floor. Engineers shouted over one another. Route access is locked out, total system freeze, cause NovaCore. Their AI just switched into auto-protection mode. A young manager hesitated before speaking, but isn't NovaCore run by Ethan Carter? Lydia froze, and in that instant, the truth hit her harder than any corporate scandal could. The man she'd heard about the passenger removed from seat 1A was the same man who held the master key to Apex survival. Meanwhile, at O'Hare Airport, Thomas Gray, the senior flight attendant from Flight 247, sat quietly in the operations office, a cup of coffee trembling in his hands. All his life, he'd believed in procedure and professional standards, but when he learned that the man he'd politely asked to leave first class was the CEO of Apex Technology Partner, something inside him cracked. "I was just following policy," he muttered. A colleague replied softly, "Maybe that's exactly the problem." Thomas fell silent. He remembered Ethan's calm eyes, not angry, just measured. The memory burned deeper than any reprimand ever could. And James Miller, the young flight attendant, he was the embodiment of learned obedience. James wasn't racist. He just did what he'd been trained to do. In his mind, VIP meant white, wealthy, tailored suit, luxury watch. When Ethan boarded the plane, James automatically assumed he didn't belong in first class. He hadn't meant to offend, he was simply doing what the system had taught him. Now, as social media exploded with Daoudashishan seat 1A, James's face was everywhere branded as the racist flight attendant. But the truth was more painful. He wasn't a monster. He was a mirror reflecting a culture that never questioned its own assumptions. Ethan didn't have to say a word. The system was already speaking for him and against itself. Back at Apex HQ, Lydia scrambled for control, signing orders, launching internal audits, crisis reports, PR statements, but she didn't understand. The real investigation wasn't inside the servers or emails. It was buried in the bones of her corporation in the belief that rules can program fairness, while forgetting that ethics can't be coded. When the meeting finally ended, Lydia remained alone. Afternoon sunlight sliced through the windows, bending across her face in fractured lines. On her desk lay two symbols of her empire, a suspended $800 million contract signed by Ethan Carter, and a printed Apex first-class ticket, seat 1A, once meant for a marketing campaign about premium customer care. Now, it was the evidence of a fallen hierarchy. Lydia exhaled, whispering to no one. "We thought we were flying high, but maybe we've just been drifting in illusion." And aboard the plane that had just landed, Ethan Carter sat quietly waiting for the world to realign itself. Because sometimes, all you have to do is let the system run long enough to reveal its own cracks. The world rarely collapses in a single explosion. More often, it begins with something small, polite enough to go unquestioned, yet wrong enough to silence everyone around it. That morning, in the first-class cabin of Apex Flight 247, everything looked perfectly normal. Soft amber lighting, gentle background music, the scent of roasted coffee mixing with the click of heels on carpet, everything just as Apex prided itself on flawless order. But in a few minutes, order was about to be redefined. Ethan Carter sat in seat 1A, flipping open a small notebook. A line from the night before stared back at him. Sometimes, silence is the strongest response. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to prove it true to the entire world. A quiet cough broke the calm. Thomas Gray, the chief flight attendant, appeared beside him with a professional smile, the kind that looked courteous to most, but to the experienced, carried the scent of bad news. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," Thomas began, his tone polished but tense. "There seems to be a small mix-up with our seating list. We'll need to have you moved to another seat." Ethan looked up, calm and direct. "I booked 1A 4 weeks ago. What seems to be the issue?" Thomas hesitated. His voice dropped slightly. "Seat 1A has been reassigned to a VIP passenger due to operational priority." That single-word priority fell like a heavy stone into the quiet cabin. Heads lifted. A man frowned. A woman chuckled softly. Ethan glanced past Thomas. Standing just behind him was Victoria Hale, board member of Apex Airways Cream Blazer, hair perfectly pinned, perfume expensive and calculated. She said nothing. Her eyes brushed past Ethan the way people look at someone who doesn't belong, a delivery man who wandered into the executive lounge. Ethan closed his notebook and stood, not out of fear, but recognition. He'd seen this scene 100 times in boardrooms, restaurants, elevators every time someone said, "I think you're in the wrong place." Only this time, the audience was bigger, and the cameras were ready. In row 2, Sarah Lee, the young woman in a gray hoodie, looked up. The scene felt painfully familiar. A black man asked to move, a white woman taking his place, and everyone else pretending it wasn't happening. She unlocked her phone, pressed record, no shouting, no protest, just the truth, captured quietly. As Ethan walked toward the back, passengers exchanged glances, sympathy mixed with silence. "He probably doesn't have elite status." Someone whispered, another murmured, "There's always a system reason. Don't make it about race." Thomas led Ethan to row 18C. His tone polite, rehearsed. "Thank you for understanding, sir. Today's flight has a few special circumstances." Ethan nodded and sat down. He opened his laptop. The pale blue glow lit his face, composed, unreadable. No one knew that inside that laptop. He held full control over Apex's AI infrastructure, the invisible engine that kept the airline running. Next to him, Sarah leaned in slightly. "I'm sorry that happened," she said quietly. "I filmed it not to stir things up, but people should see." Ethan smiled faintly. Sometimes seeing is enough. Up front, Victoria Hale reclined in 1A and ordered a glass of wine. "How strange," she said to James Miller, the young attendant. "People these days get so sensitive. It's just a seat." James forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." But he didn't. Not really. He was just following rules, the kind no one ever writes down, but everyone knows by heart. The flight took off. The seatbelt sign dimmed. Ethan gazed out the window. The sky streaked with orange light. He didn't feel angry, only that deep, tired recognition that history repeats itself, just with new uniforms and softer words. He opened his secure console, Omega System Access. The screen read Master Control, NovaCore Protocols. His finger hovered over Enter, but he didn't press it, not yet, because true justice doesn't come from anger. Meanwhile, social media caught fire. Sarah's video spread in minutes, the black man giving up his seat, Victoria's polite smile, the caption, operational priority, that's what they call it. The first comment read, "Isn't that the CEO of NovaCore?" Another confirmed it, within an hour. Seat 1A was trending worldwide, on board. Silence thickened. Thomas made his routine cabin check, avoiding Ethan's eyes. He felt it something far bigger than a seating error unfolding right beneath his feet. Up front. Victoria scrolled through her phone. Her face paled as she saw the headline, "Apex Airways accused of racial bias toward NovaCore CEO." Her hand trembled. A few drops of wine splashed onto the carpet. Thomas noticed but said nothing. He knew some stains don't come out with towels. Ethan stayed silent. He knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. But he wasn't seeking revenge. He was simply preparing to let the system face its own reflection to watch it. Finally, see itself clearly. He closed his eyes. Outside, the sky stretched endless and blue. Inside, the steady hum of the engines pulsed like the heartbeat of a world about to realize fairness cannot be engineered by protocol. And at the very moment the plane lifted off the ground, the first domino fell not in the air, but inside the hearts of those who believed they were already above it all. There was no outburst, no shouting, no protest, only a black man quietly stepping away from seat 1A, walking down to row 18C, and opening his laptop. Inside the cabin of Apex Flight 247, no one spoke, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something wrong. So wrong, in fact, that silence itself had become complicity. Ethan Carter sat still. He reopened his screen, his eyes following lines of code scrolling like a steady heartbeat. Outside, the sky was crystal blue clouds spreading across it like pale ink on glass. He typed a few commands, pretending to check a system status, but what he was really studying was people. Up front, Victoria Hale settled comfortably into seat 1A. She dabbed at the armrest with a napkin, then opened her iPad. Her expression betrayed no guilt, as if what had happened was a routine inconvenience part of the natural order of the world. Ethan caught the reflection of her in his laptop screen. A quiet laugh almost escaped him, not out of anger, but from recognition. There are people, he thought, who truly believe they were born to sit in the front. As Thomas Gray, the head attendant, passed by, Ethan spoke softly. "Mr. Gray, just a small question. Operational priority, is that a rule or a choice?" Thomas hesitated, uneasy. "Sir, it's a flexible company policy. We apply it in special cases." Ethan nodded slowly. "I see. And what makes a case?" Special Thomas had no answer. He gave a strained smile and walked away. Ethan didn't need more words. The question itself had already done its work. Truth, he knew, doesn't need to shout. It just needs silence to echo in. Across the aisle, Sarah Lee kept glancing up from her phone. She couldn't understand how the man beside her could stay so calm. "Aren't you angry?" she whispered. "I've learned that anger makes them comfortable," Ethan said quietly. "When you're angry, they stop listening and start justifying." Sarah stared at him. Something in his calmness sent a chill down her spine, that kind of composure that wasn't restraint anymore. It was power. Ethan knew exactly what he was up against. This wasn't about a seat. It was about a system, one that had turned discrimination into polite routine. A culture of professional hierarchy designed so that those being wronged would smile through it, and those doing it would still believe they were right. He'd seen it in international boardrooms, where diversity was a buzzword, but every leadership photo looked the same. He'd heard it in interviews where culture fit really meant looks like us, thinks like us. Today, it was just repeating itself again in the form of a chair, a polite smile, and an administrative reason. Up front, James Miller, the young flight attendant, whispered to a colleague, "I don't get why everyone's making this a big deal." "Ms. Hale is a VIP," his coworker replied. "Didn't you see how that man didn't even react?" James shrugged. Maybe he knows he's in a lower tier. That last phrase, lower tier, reached Thomas Gray's ears. He turned, ready to reprimand him, but stopped himself. After decades in the industry, he knew this wasn't about one boy's mistake. It was the product of a culture trained to obey prejudice, where people could do wrong and still believe they were right, as long as they followed procedure. Ethan kept working. The code on his screen monitored Apex Airways' Central Performance System software he and his NovaCore team had spent 3 years building. With just a few lines, he could sever the data hub. He knew that. And perhaps the irony was, they'd forgotten that too, that the man they'd quietly pushed to the back held the very keys to their empire. He looked up and met Sarah's eyes. She seemed to sense what he was thinking. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "Nothing," Ethan replied. "The system will teach itself. I just have to stay quiet long enough." On Twitter, the hashtag #HaSeat1A was exploding. Tech insiders recognized Ethan's face, tagging him alongside the NovaCore logo. A trending post read, "If this story's real." Apex just disrespected the man running their $800 million infrastructure. That news hadn't reached the plane yet, but it was only a matter of time. The storm had already begun, born from one man's silence. In Chicago, Lydia Monroe, Apex's CEO, sat in a boardroom when her assistant handed her a phone. "Ma'am, you need to see this." The screen showed Sarah's video, Ethan standing, Victoria taking his seat, and the passengers watching in silence. Lydia frowned. She wasn't overtly racist, but she didn't need to be. She understood immediately this wasn't about one employee or one mistake. It was about the entire way her system worked. Back on the plane, Thomas passed by again and stopped beside Ethan. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize for the inconvenience earlier." Ethan looked up and smiled faintly. "It's fine. It's just a seat." Thomas nodded, but deep down he knew sometimes a single seat is enough to make an empire crumble. Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back, eyes tracing the cabin ceiling. He thought of his father's words, "Never let anyone define your worth by where you sit." A soft smile curved on his lips. No one could see it, but in that quiet moment, a decision had already formed in his mind. It wasn't vengeance, it was a moral correction. Justice, he believed, didn't need rage, just the right command, executed at the right moment. As the plane glided through the clouds, data streams and Apex servers began to flicker, and within hours, the world would learn sometimes. One man's silence is the loudest sound justice ever makes. The world has its own quiet way of balancing itself if you wait long enough. Truth always finds a way to surface. As Apex Flight 247 glided through bands of white clouds thousands of miles away, the airline's digital heart kept beating, hundreds of servers managing flight paths, fuel distribution, baggage routing, and the airline's entire AI-driven infrastructure. No one at Apex's headquarters realized that every one of those servers pulsed to a rhythm designed and owned by NovaCore Technologies. The company, founded by Ethan Carter, the $800 million contract signed less than a month ago. Granted NovaCore total control over Apex's operational AI, a system so advanced it wasn't just software, it was the brain of the entire airline, and Ethan, as CEO, held the master switch one line of code away from halting the entire network. He glanced at the small silver lock icon glowing at the corner of his laptop screen, confirmation that full access remained in his hands. He didn't touch it, but he knew one click, and Apex's entire flight grid could go dark for minutes, or forever. He thought of the thousands of employees working beneath that system, the passengers who only wanted to get home safely, and the engineers who had built their careers on it. Justice, he knew, becomes meaningless if born from vengeance, but silence only carries weight when the powerful are forced to hear it. In Chicago, Lydia Monroe studied her financial reports. Everything looked stable, but the technical graphs showed strange pauses, system delays, frozen processes, data lagging. She didn't know the cause sat on Flight 247 in seat 18C, quietly typing. Her assistant entered, "Ms. Monroe, NovaCore just sent a security update request. They say they need to activate something called Protocol Omega to test system defense integrity." Lydia frowned. "Omega, I thought only NovaCore's CEO could authorize that mode." "Yes, ma'am," the assistant replied, "Mr. Ethan Carter." Lydia chuckled lightly, unaware that the rope tightening around her empire had already begun its pull. "Well, if it's just a test, let them run it. We're paying them enough to do their job." Meanwhile, in row 18C, Ethan remained silent. He wasn't running a test. He was waiting. Beside him, Sarah Lee kept scrolling. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. News outlets had caught wind of the viral video. CNN's breaking ticker already read Apex Airways under scrutiny after alleged discrimination incident involving tech CEO. She leaned toward him. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan didn't look up. His tone was low, even deliberate. "I just want them to understand the price of discretionary priority." A simple sentence, but it carried a truth deeper than anger. Every unjust system hides its own failure point inside its arrogance. On his screen, the NovaCore admin console glowed, "System access Apex Airways. Active. Override available." A prompt appeared, "Activate Omega." He didn't press it, not yet. Instead, he opened his notebook and wrote, "No one should have to shout to be heard." True justice, when bright enough, makes the shadows move on their own. Up front, Victoria Hale felt her control slipping. Her phone buzzed with a flood of messages, colleagues sending her the viral clip. There she was, the powerful executive claiming a seat from a black man, frozen in slow motion. Captioned, "Operational priority or racial privilege." Her hand trembled, spilling a few drops of wine. Around her, passengers whispered, their glances sharp and curious. For the first time in years, Victoria realized she no longer controlled the narrative. Thomas Gray, the head attendant, received a message on his crew device. "Maintain order. Media will be waiting at landing. Prepare for press inquiries." He swallowed hard. This was no longer about one flight. It was becoming a reputation crisis. Thomas turned toward row E18. Ethan was still there, calm as ever, the still center of a storm. And in those quiet eyes, Thomas saw something chilling, not fury, but certainty. The certainty of a man who already knows how this ends. High above the earth, the airplane became a line dividing two worlds. Up front, the confident few, convinced control was theirs. In the back, the quiet man holding the power to decide their fate. One command could ground every plane, freeze every route, crash the stock, and force the entire hierarchy to its knees. But Ethan wasn't seeking destruction. He sought a correction to teach the system, in its own native language data. Below, in Apex's command center, chaos erupted. AI scheduling just went offline, shouted one engineer. We're locked out of admin privileges, another added. Fuel and baggage control modules are frozen. Lydia burst into the operations room, eyes widening at the red alert on the main monitor system locked by Protocol Omega. Administrator access required. Her voice trembled. Who authorized Omega mode? Only NovaCore can. Ma'am, specifically, Ethan Carter. A long silence fell. Lydia stared at the flashing words, access denied. Her voice was barely a whisper. Oh my God, what is he doing to us on the plane? Ethan saw the confirmation appear. System freeze initiated. He looked out the window. The sky had deepened into twilight. A distant lightning flash illuminated his reflection, sharp, calm, unshaken. He didn't smile. Justice, when carried out properly, never brings joy, only peace. He closed his laptop, leaned back, and let the faint cabin light flicker across his face. Up front, the old world was quietly collapsing. And when the plane finally touched down, none of them knew that every step they took on the concrete echoed through a changed world, one where the man they'd asked to move seats now held the power to decide their future. Every revolution begins with someone who dares to say, I saw it. Apex Flight 247 kept slicing through the horizon, but inside the cabin something had shifted, a quiet pressure, heavy and expectant, pressing against every unspoken breath. Sarah Lee, seated in 18B, looked at the man beside her. Ethan Carter, still calmly typing, the faint glow of his laptop reflecting off his composed face. He didn't seem angry or anxious, only certain. There was a weight to his stillness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly when to wait and when to act. Sarah didn't know much about him, only his name whispered now and then in the tech world, but something about the way he carried silence made her feel that this moment deserved a witness. She unlocked her phone, opened X Twitter, and began typing on Apex Flight 247. The black CEO of NovaCore was forced to give up his first-class seat for an Apex Airways board member, Victoria Hale. No one apologized. No one questioned it. She hesitated, then added one last line. Sometimes, silence is also a crime. Seat. She hit post. It took less than 3 minutes for the tweet to catch fire. At first, the tech community noticed those who knew Ethan Carter wasn't just another CEO. He was the man who'd built ethical AI frameworks, who'd spoken at the UN about technology's moral compass. A reply appeared beneath her post. If this is true, Apex just made a historic mistake. Another, they kicked out the guy who runs their 800mm system. You can't make this up. And, like falling dominoes, Seat 1A ignited across the globe. On board, no one yet realized the scale of the storm forming outside, but the atmosphere had changed. 2 passengers whispered in row 17. Is that girl recording? I think she's live streaming. Sarah wasn't. She was simply documenting, recording the moment Ethan was told to move. Thomas's detached tone as he said, operational priority, no captions, no commentary, just the truth. Because in today's world, you don't need to scream to show injustice. You just have to let people see it. Up front, Victoria Hale felt the eyes behind her. She unlocked her phone, froze. Her seat 1A trending #1 worldwide. The video had nearly 800,000 views showing her taking seat 1A, while Ethan stood, nothing else. But that nothing said everything. She turned to James Miller, her voice tight. "Who allowed filming on board? That's against policy." James stammered. I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no current rule preventing it." Victoria pressed her lips together. For the first time, policy, her shield of control, had become her cage. Farther back, Thomas Gray noticed Sarah still filming. He started toward her, then stopped. For years, he'd lived in the gray zone where keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But something cracked in him at that moment. If silence helped injustice breathe, wasn't he part of the problem? He turned away. This time, his silence wasn't submission, it was permission for truth to exist. Meanwhile, at Apex headquarters, panic erupted. Lydia Monroe's assistant burst into the conference room. "Ms. Monroe, your seat 1A is trending worldwide top 1. The video has almost 2 million views." 2 million, Lydia snapped. "When does Flight 247 land? In about 90 minutes, ma'am." "But CNN's already running it. On the wall screen." The footage looped Ethan standing. Victoria, sitting the Chiron, reading Apex Airways accused of racial bias toward tech, CEO on Flight 247. Lydia stood motionless. This wasn't a PR issue anymore. It was an existential one. The stock price would drop. The board would demand answers. And the worst part, she knew the man in that video could, with one command, shut the entire company down, high above. Ethan was unaware how far the story had traveled. Sarah turned to him, voice hesitant. "Do you want me to take it down? It's blowing up." Ethan smiled faintly. "No need. Once truth takes off, you can't call it back." He paused, then added softly, "But make sure it doesn't turn into anger. Let it become a mirror instead." Sarah nodded. She understood he didn't want revenge. He wanted reflection. Around the cabin, more passengers pulled out their phones. A middle-aged man whispered to his camera, "I'm on Flight 247. What you're hearing online, it's real." A woman nearby filmed Thomas and Victoria speaking, posting it with the caption, "Not everyone needs to shout to fight." Some battles are won by quiet dignity. Each phone became an eye, and the system that had long thrived on invisibility suddenly had nowhere to hide. Below, an Apex PR department, chaos ruled. A trembling communications director spoke up. "We should issue an apology immediately." Apologize to whom? Lydia's voice was ice. "To Ethan Carter. Ma'am, he's a partner, not a victim." Lydia snapped, "And he's still on our plane." A silence fell. Everyone in the room knew one keystroke from that man, and their entire operation could vanish. Above the clouds, sunset poured through the windows. Ethan closed his laptop, gazing at the orange horizon. Sarah watched him, her voice low. "Do you think people will change after this?" He answered, "Not right away. But sometimes a single hashtag can shake a culture if it forces people to see their own shadow." As the captain's voice announced, "Prepare for landing," no one felt like this was just another flight. Seat 1A, once the symbol of privilege, had become the emblem of moral collapse. And Sayet 18C, where one man sat quietly, without anger or vengeance, had become the center of the world's attention. And when the plane's wheels finally touched the runway, truth touched down with it, carrying the weight of millions of watching eyes. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it only needs a phone and someone brave enough to press post. Justice doesn't always begin with a shout. Sometimes it begins with a very small click. When the wheels of Apex Flight 247 touched the runway, the whole cabin exhaled in relief. But for Ethan Carter, that moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a decision he had been holding in his heart for the past 2 hours. On the laptop screen before him, a line flickered, Protocol Omega, ready to deploy. He planned to wait to speak with Lydia Monroe back at the office, in a quiet, professional setting. But fate has its own way of testing people. From the first-class cabin, Victoria Hale's voice rose clearly, not loud, but just enough for everyone to hear. She was on the phone, probably with a colleague or a journalist. "I'm so tired of this fake diversity act. Everywhere you go, they try to shove a few different colored faces in just to look fair. In the end, real ability still decides, doesn't it?" Some passengers glanced her way, uncomfortable. But Victoria continued speaking with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to fear losing her seat. Ethan looked up, watching her through the glass partition. He said nothing, just closed his laptop, then opened it again. The screen displayed a line already prepared, ready to act. His finger hovered above the keyboard. Inside, he could almost hear his father's voice. "Sometimes, son, you have to let the system taste the injustice it creates." And then he pressed down. There was no dramatic effect, no alarms, no flashing lights, just a cold, simple line that appeared Protocol Omega engaged. At that same moment, at Apex Airways headquarters in Chicago, the storm began not in the sky, but in the servers and glass offices where power had always felt safe. No one noticed anything at first, until the AI scheduling system suddenly went dark. A flight operator stared at the monitor, thinking it was a glitch, but then the second window froze, then the third. Soon, the entire control board turned red. "We can't access the flight schedule." "What about the baggage system?" "Down 2, the data's locked within 8 minutes, baggage routing, crew optimization, and fuel distribution. All stopped working. Everything connected to Apex's artificial intelligence stood still like a living body whose brain had just shut down." Lydia Monroe, the CEO, was about to attend a press briefing when her phone rang. "Non-stop, Ms. Monroe. The AI system's gone down completely. We can't reboot it. Has anyone contacted NovaCore? We tried. But Mr. Carter's on Flight Apex 247. No one can reach him." Lydia froze. She knew instantly there was only one person on Earth who could touch the system at that level: Ethan Carter. Back on the plane, Sarah Lee noticed Ethan's calm expression as he looked out the window. She didn't understand everything, but she could sense something powerful had shifted. "Did you do something?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just asked the system to take a little break. Sometimes, even machines need to relearn fairness." Sarah stared at him, stunned. She'd never heard such a quiet kind of defiance. At the front, Victoria Hale's phone buzzed. She answered, her voice trembling. "Victoria, the system's crashing. We can't control the data. NovaCore's blocked all access." "What happened? I don't know," she stammered. "You're on the same flight as Ethan Carter. You'd better hope he's still willing to talk." Victoria went pale. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance. Thomas Gray, the head attendant, noticed the tension spreading through the cabin. He walked over to Ethan, his tone cautious. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" "Nothing serious," Ethan replied evenly. "It's just time some people learn that a seat doesn't define a person's worth." Thomas didn't respond. He understood, but he knew better than to interfere. When the plane stopped at the gate, passengers were told to remain seated due to technical difficulties. Whispers filled the air. "Must be a system glitch." "A glitch? This airline uses NovaCore's AI, then they're in trouble." Sarah looked at Ethan again. "Do you realize they're panicking?" "I know. And you're still calm?" "I'm not calm," Ethan said softly. "I've just chosen not to let anger destroy me." Meanwhile, at Apex headquarters, Lydia finally received an email from NovaCore. The subject line read, "Only ethical response." The message was short and direct. Apex Airways has violated humanitarian partnership policy. Protocol Omega will remain active until an emergency ethics meeting is held with NovaCore's CEO present. E.C. Lydia stood still, the phone slipping from her hand. She understood now, in the modern world, power no longer belonged to those in first class. It belonged to those who held both knowledge and conscience. Everyone knew what that meant. The man they'd humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, the one they'd told to step aside, was now the only person who could save them. A furious executive, Harold Grant, slammed his fist on the table. "We can't let one man hold us hostage. Get cybersecurity to restore from backups." The lead engineer's voice was weary. "Already tried, sir. Every backup requires NovaCore authentication. Without the root key, we're chasing our tails." Then the lights flickered. Every screen in the command center went black, and one message appeared. White text on black system integrity, locked by Protocol Omega pending ethical review. Nobody spoke. It was as if the building itself had stopped breathing. A young PR staffer whispered, "Ethan Carter. He's shut us down." Outside the glass walls, the media had already gathered camera flashes lighting up the sidewalk. A Reuters reporter shouted through the doors, "Monroe, has Apex been hacked by its own partner? Is it true your airline discriminated against NovaCore's CEO? Will Apex take responsibility?" Lydia didn't answer. She turned back to her team, her voice low, solemn. "When you treat someone like they're beneath you, sometimes you're the one bowing and you don't even realize it." While chaos consumed Chicago, Ethan sat quietly on the tarmac. He didn't need to check the news, he already knew what was happening. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums softly through the wires. Sarah's phone buzzed beside him. She read aloud Apex Airways shares down 18%. CNN live from headquarters. Her voice trembled. "You've just stopped an empire. Do you regret it?" Ethan gazed out the window, sunset light reflecting calm across his face. "No, sometimes," he said gently. "To make people learn, you have to make them stop." Back in Chicago, Lydia's composure cracked just enough to show exhaustion. "Prepare a press conference," she said finally, "and get me Ethan Carter, whatever it takes. If we can't reach him, Apex collapses in 48 hours. A young aide hesitated, and if he refuses to talk, Lydia looked out the glass wall toward the flashing cameras and said quietly, "Then we'll have to learn how to bow to the man we refuse to let sit in the front row." And on the runway, as the plane doors opened and the flash of cameras filled the air, Ethan stepped out. People called his name, shouted questions, begged for answers, but he said nothing, because the storm outside wasn't his creation. It was born from the arrogance of those who thought fairness was a privilege. outside. Los Angeles greeted dusk with a pale, golden calm, the kind of light that looks gentle, but carries a chill underneath. Inside Apex Flight 247, the air was dense, taut as a string pulled too long. After 2 hours of silent tension, the plane finally touched down. But no one stood, no one spoke, no one even breathed loudly. Everyone could feel it. Justice was about to walk through the narrow door of truth. The cabin speakers pinged with a priority signal. Then, on every screen, a message appeared. Receive VIP Ethan Carter, full protocol of protection and courtesy. Directive from CEO Lydia Monroe. Thomas Gray, the flight attendant who had ordered Ethan out of seat 1A, froze. His hands gripped the seat back as though it could hold him upright under the weight of shame. Beside him, James Miller, the young attendant who had sneered earlier, swallowed hard and pretended to check the overhead bins. Thomas's voice cracked. "You saw that message," James nodded. "Yeah. So, what do we do now?" Before anyone could answer, Ethan stood tall, calm, dressed in a simple gray shirt that somehow carried more authority than any uniform in the cabin. He said quietly, "Do what we should have done from the start." Silence fell like a curtain. Every head turned toward him, the man they had watched being humiliated hours earlier, now standing with quiet dignity that commanded the room without effort. He walked slowly up the aisle, stopping midway to face the two attendants. "I have one question," he said, his voice level, firm, never rising. "Who decided that I wasn't worthy of the seat I paid for?" Thomas's lips parted, but no sound came. James stared at the floor. Every phone in the cabin lifted, not from voyeurism, but from reverence. Everyone knew they were witnessing something history would remember. A woman in row 16 murmured softly, "Say it, Thomas." Ethan waited. He didn't push. He simply stood still, letting the silence do its work, because sometimes silence tells the truth better than words ever can. Finally, Thomas spoke, voice trembling. "It was the company's operational policy. I was following orders." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Whose orders? Thomas swallowed. "Ground operations, and Mrs. Hale, Victoria Hale, the board member." The cabin rippled like glass cracking under heat. Every eye turned toward Victoria Hale, still seated in 1A, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Ethan took a few measured steps closer, stopping just 2 meters away. He didn't glare. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her long enough for the weight of her choices to settle in. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I don't care about this seat. What I care about is the system that made it possible and the silence that allowed it to happen." His tone was steady, calm, deliberate, like someone stating a law of physics, not emotion. No one spoke. Some passengers bowed their heads. Others stared forward, eyes glistening. Ethan took a breath, then said softly, "Silence is a choice, and today I'm choosing not to be silent." Right then, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, Apex Airways systems are still under restoration. Please remain seated until further notice, by order of CEO Lydia Monroe." Murmurs spread, then faded into stillness. Sarah Lee, the young woman whose single post had ignited the world, raised her phone toward Ethan. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Carter, the whole world's watching now." Ethan met her eyes and nodded once. He didn't need to say a word, because Apex's own collapse had already spoken for him. When the door finally opened, A blinding wall of flashes flooded the cabin. Security officers and senior Apex staff waited below, faces tight, uncertain whether to greet him as a threat or a savior. An officer handed Thomas a document stamped in red emergency directive, receive VIP Ethan Carter with full executive privilege. This man is not merely a passenger, he is the reason this airline still has a chance to exist. Thomas looked up, eyes stinging. He turned to Ethan and bowed slightly, not out of fear, but respect. Ethan returned the nod, then stepped off the plane into the sea of cameras. Waiting on the tarmac was Lydia Monroe, Apex's CEO. She approached, extending her hand. Her voice was hoarse but sincere. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Carter. This entire company does." Ethan looked at her hand, then met her eyes. "I don't need an apology," he said softly. "I need a real change." For a moment, there was only the wind and the hum of engines cooling. Then he added, "I didn't lock your systems to punish you. I did it to show you that when technology is controlled by people who don't respect humanity, it becomes the most dangerous weapon in the world." Lydia said nothing. She just nodded, because she knew he was right. Inside the cabin, Victoria Hale still hadn't moved. Sarah Lee filmed her not in cruelty, but as a record of consequence. A middle-aged man whispered to no one in particular, "Sometimes the most expensive lessons come from the seat we thought we deserved." Ethan stepped fully onto the tarmac, surrounded by reporters shouting his name. He didn't make a statement. He didn't point fingers. He simply said one sentence, calm, low, steady, and the world fell silent to hear it. "I just hope that from now on, no one ever has to stand up and leave their seat, simply because someone else thinks they have the wrong color of skin." The truth landed with that flight, but the consequences were only beginning. Because when light finally hits the darkness, the shadows don't disappear, they're simply forced to show themselves. That afternoon, Los Angeles International didn't just receive a flight, it received an earthquake. Journalists crowded behind security lines, passengers raised their phones to record, and whispers rolled through the terminal like a rising tide. No one knew exactly what had happened on Apex Flight 247, only that one black man had just made the nation's largest airline hold its breath. When the cabin door opened, Ethan Carter stepped into a blinding storm of flashes. He didn't flinch, didn't wave. Every step he took carried the quiet confidence of someone long familiar with chaos, someone who knew he didn't have to shout to be heard. Waiting by the gate was Lydia Monroe, CEO of Apex Airways. Gone was the towering executive who once graced magazine covers and corporate summits. In her place stood a woman, diminished small against the roar of the crowd, her face tight with guilt and fear. Their eyes met. One carried the silence of a man once humiliated. The other, the silence of someone who had just realized power cannot buy back dignity. Lydia spoke first, her voice trembling under its practiced calm. "Mr. Carter, I want to offer you Apex's formal apology." Ethan didn't respond right away. He wasn't after an apology. He was after accountability. He stepped forward, facing the cameras, and said in a voice steady enough to slice through the noise, "Mrs. Monroe, apologies don't make an unjust system fair. They just make the speaker feel a little lighter." The crowd went still. Lydia lowered her head. Then Ethan continued, his tone cold. "Deliberate Apex has 72 hours to prove it deserves the public's trust, not with words, but with action. If not, I will terminate NovaCore's $800 million contract with Apex. And when that happens, your entire flight control infrastructure will shut down permanently. The terminal erupted in gasps. Some people covered their mouths, others just stared, stunned. His words weren't loud, but they carried the calm, deadly weight of truth backed by power. Lydia stammered, "Mr. Carter, $800 million. You realize that would Ethan cut her off? Quiet but sharp, force you to change? Yes, I realize. Nearby, Sarah Lee, the young woman who had filmed the incident, was live streaming. Over 2 million people watched in real time. Comments flooded the screen. That's justice, no shouting, just truth. Seat, oh hey, the lesson money can't buy." Lydia tried to recover her composure. "We'll do everything possible to make this right." Apex does not discriminate, Ethan's eyes fixed on her calm, piercing, unrelenting. Not discriminating isn't the same as being fair. You don't have to convince me. Mrs. Monroe, convince the people watching you right now. He turned, scanning the sea of passengers, reporters, and bystanders' faces of every color, every walk of life. You have 72 hours, starting now, and with that, he walked away, leaving Lydia standing frozen in the flood of cameras. Inside the Apex control room, alarms and conference calls erupted. Lydia's voice echoed through the intercom. "We have 3 days to save this company and maybe to save our own humanity." Across the world, news headlines flashed: CNN Apex Airways under fire after racial discrimination scandal. NovaCore CEO issues public ultimatum. Reuters man removed from first class shuts down 800-nominal airline system. BBC corporate reckoning. Apex forced into crisis by its own prejudice. The story was no longer about an airline. It had become a symbol of an era. Back at the terminal, Sarah caught up to Ethan, breathless. "Mr. Carter, are you really going to do it?" "Shut Apex down," he smiled gently. "No, I'll let them choose. I just held up a mirror. Whether they dare to look into it, that's on them." Sarah fell silent. Under the fading sunlight, she realized that Ethan's power wasn't in code or contracts. It was in his calm, his refusal to be consumed by anger. Before leaving, Ethan paused by the terminal window, gazing at the Apex jet still parked on the runway. "They think I'm fighting to get even," he said softly, almost to himself. "But all I want is for them to learn to listen before someone has to make them." An older passenger who had witnessed it all stepped forward, shaking his hand. "You know, son, I've flown Apex for 30 years. Never seen anyone silence them like that, not with shouting, but with truth." Ethan nodded, smiling faintly. Sometimes, silence is the loudest sound there is. Meanwhile, inside Apex headquarters, Lydia sat alone in her office, staring at the NovaCore contract on her desk. It wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was a mirror, showing her what leadership really meant. She opened her laptop and typed the first line of a new internal memo: 72 hours to save this company. 72 hours to relearn how to treat people. But time waits for no one. As the clock began to count down, every decision from the boardroom to the hangar floor would determine whether Apex deserved to survive or not. 3 days after Ethan Carter's ultimatum, America seemed to be holding its breath. Every hour that passed, the name Apex Airways flashed across TV screens again, and every time it did, their stock price dropped a little further. Within 24 hours, Apex's market value had fallen 23%. Investors fled, customers canceled flights, and every post the company made online drowned beneath a tidal wave of public outrage. People called it the Seat 1A effect, a lesson in how one small act, when done at the right moment, can ignite the fire of justice. In Washington, D.C., the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) officially launched an investigation. What began as a discrimination inquiry quickly widened into a probe of Apex's internal culture. Leaked emails, audio files, and chat logs revealed that Ethan wasn't the first countless employees of color. Women and Asian staff had faced quiet systemic bias for years. A spokesperson for the FAA told CNN, "We're not investigating an incident. We're investigating a system that may have normalized discrimination." That single sentence sliced through Apex's glossy facade like a blade through glass. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Thomas Gray, the senior attendant from Flight 247, faced the press for the first time. Standing before a packed briefing room, he tried to keep his voice steady. "I was following company policy. We were instructed to reassign Seat 1A for a priority passenger." A female reporter in the front row asked quietly but sharply, "And do you think that policy was fair?" Thomas froze. The question was simple, unescapable. After a long pause, he whispered, "I never really thought about it." That one sentence went viral. Within hours, millions had shared the clip, captioned with the words, "And that's the problem, they don't think." No one hated Thomas. He wasn't a villain. But he became the symbol of something far more dangerous than prejudice indifference. Across the country in New York, Victoria Hale, the woman from Seat 1A, held her own press conference. Wearing a crisp white suit, she stood behind a podium, her voice smooth, her face composed. "This has all been misunderstood," she declared. "I never meant to offend anyone. I was simply following established procedures for priority passengers." But before the microphones could cool, Sarah Lee posted a 14-minute video to social media, the uncut, original footage from the flight. The video began with Victoria's unmistakable voice. "Sometimes I think they let people like him in business class just to add some color to the photo. Nothing was misunderstood, nothing taken out of context. It was all there clear, raw, undeniable." Within 4 hours, the video hit 12 million views. Media outlets called it the visual indictment. Victoria's accounts were flooded until she deactivated them. A finance journal headlined the fallout bluntly, "From Seat 1A to the bottom of her career. The fall of a woman who never learned humility." That Monday night, the Apex Board of Directors convened an emergency session. Under immense pressure, Lydia Monroe made a formal statement. Victoria Hale will step down temporarily from the board to allow for an internal ethics investigation. Outside headquarters, reporters swarmed Victoria as she left the building. "Do you have anything to say to Mr. Carter?" one shouted. She stopped, her eyes hollow. "I just wish I'd stayed silent on that flight." Back at NovaCore, Ethan worked as usual, calm, focused, untouched by the media storm. He made no public statements, no interviews, no posts, but his silence echoed louder than any press release. A senior columnist at the Washington Post wrote, "Ethan Carter reminded us that justice doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needs one calm man asking the right question." Inside Apex headquarters, Lydia studied the new financial report. Revenue had dropped 41% in 3 days. Partners suspended contracts pending investigation. She sat motionless for a long time before picking up the phone. "HR," she said softly, restart the entire corporate culture training program. And this time, not for the cameras. On the other end, a trembling voice replied, "Ma'am, without Ethan Carter, we won't be able to bring the systems back online in time." Lydia looked out her office window, sunset glinting off the glass towers. "I know. Maybe the only way to prove we deserve another chance is to start by changing how we see people." Meanwhile, Sarah Lee, now a media sensation, refused every interview request. Instead, she posted a single statement: "I never meant to be a hero. I just did what anyone should do. Record what's wrong when you see it. If it wasn't me, it would have been someone else." That post was shared millions of times. One comment beneath it read, "The world doesn't lack good people. It lacks people brave enough to do good when everyone else hesitates." On the third night, as the countdown neared the 72nd hour, the nation waited. Would Ethan press the button, the permanent shutdown he'd promised, on every evening newscast? Anchors repeated the same line: "The question is no longer whether Apex will survive, but whether it has learned anything worth surviving for." In his office, Ethan watched the words "Protocol Omega Active" blink on his screen. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, then stopped. Not from hesitation, but from understanding. Because sometimes the harshest punishment isn't action, it's the waiting. And as the clock struck the 73rd hour, the world held its breath. Ethan Carter remained silent while Lydia Monroe, once the head of an empire, faced the real moment of justice, not about who had power, but who had the courage to change. Hour 70. 2 hours before the 72-hour deadline. The headquarters of Apex Airways glowed like daylight in the middle of the night. Outside, swarms of reporters filled the plaza, waiting to see whether the fallen empire of aviation would survive the judgment that Ethan Carter had handed down. Inside the 38th floor boardroom, Lydia Monroe stood tall, weary but resolute, surrounded by advisors, lawyers, and human resource directors. On the table lay a thick dossier, stamped in bold Apex Airways, comprehensive reform and corporate responsibility plan. No empty slogans, no rehearsed apologies. This was the resolution Apex had to present to Ethan, not to beg for mercy, but to prove they still deserved to exist. Section 1. Anti-Bias Training. Every employee, from board members to part-time staff, would undergo a mandatory in-person diversity and bias training program, led by an independent organization. No pre-recorded compliance videos, real scenarios, real accountability. Each case study would dissect what happened on Flight 247 piece by painful piece. Section 2. Independent Audit. A global law firm would conduct a full internal policy audit, from service procedures to promotion systems. Findings would be published quarterly, ensuring no one could hide behind the phrase "internal matter" again. Section 3. VIP Policy Overhaul. The term corporate priority, once a hallmark of privilege, would be abolished. Seat and service priority would now depend solely on ticket class, not on social rank, status, or title. In Apex's new world, power could no longer buy place. Section 4. Passenger Council. A 12-member passenger advisory board, including journalists, lawyers, disability advocates, and representatives of minority communities, would oversee Apex's service ethics directly. For the first time in U.S. aviation history, a major airline would allow the public to monitor itself. Section 5. Financial Sanctions. Any confirmed act of discrimination or ethical misconduct would trigger automatic financial penalties, deducted directly from executive bonuses. No more apologies in writing, only real consequences. When Lydia signed the final page, she looked up at the clock. 1 hour and 47 minutes left. A consultant leaned in. "Mrs. Monroe, are you sure you want to submit this now? Carter might reject it." Lydia smiled, faintly exhausted, but honest. "If he doesn't accept it, then maybe we don't deserve to be saved." Across the country in San Francisco, Ethan Carter sat in his NovaCore office overlooking the dark shimmer of the Pacific. An email marked urgent arrived from Apex. He didn't even need to open it to know what it was the moment Lydia chose to face the mirror. He read every page carefully, his eyes, no longer cold, still measured, searching for sincerity, not perfection. When he finished, he picked up the phone. "I've reviewed your proposal," he said. Lydia's voice trembled slightly. "It's not perfect, but it's a beginning." Ethan paused. "Have you ever thought that maybe the thing that needs reforming most isn't the company, but the way leadership thinks?" She took a breath. "I think, today, I finally started to understand that." There was a long silence. Then Ethan spoke slowly, every word deliberate, measured like a verdict. "I'll unlock the system at 70 hours, but on 2 conditions." Lydia tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm listening. First, I want a public quarterly report detailing every step of your reform, open for anyone to see. Not for me to monitor you, but so the public knows they're being respected." He paused. "Second, I want a signed resignation letter on your desk. If any commitment in that plan is broken, you'll submit it immediately, no discussion, no delay." The boardroom on Lydia's end fell silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Lydia's voice came hoarse, but steady. "I agree." Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, though she couldn't see it, and pressed enter. Protocol Omega disengaged. Across Apex's data centers, systems roared back to life. Flight maps reignited, routes blinking on screens like veins rediscovering blood flow. But there were no cheers this time, no applause, because everyone understood what they'd regained wasn't just a network, but a chance to redeem their humanity. The next morning, NovaCore issued an official statement. Apex Airways systems have been restored following submission of a transparent reform plan with ethical safeguards. NovaCore affirms that technology only matters when guided by morality. Beneath the announcement, Sarah Lee left a simple comment. 1 seat changed the entire sky. The words spread across every platform, a quiet, resonant reminder that sometimes the smallest moments can make the world look at itself differently. Everyone thought the story was over. But true change doesn't live in paperwork, it lives in choices. And the hardest test comes when no one's watching. A year after the Seat 1A incident. America had already forgotten many loud headlines, but people still spoke of Ethan Carter and the moment that made an entire corporate world stop and look at itself. The story didn't end in that airport. It rippled outward, touching every life connected to that day, each person carrying their own consequence, their own lesson. Victoria Hale. The woman who once sat in Seat 1A, a throne of privilege and pride, had become a case study in business ethics lectures. After the federal investigation, she was sued for workplace discrimination and violation of board conduct ethics. The verdict required her to pay $850,000 in compensation to anti-racism organizations and banned her from serving on any corporate board for 5 years. In a short NBC interview, the woman who once embodied power said something that left many viewers silent. "I used to think power meant making people bow. Now I know. Real power is knowing when to bow yourself." She later left the city, retreating to Vermont, where she planted lavender and wrote a memoir titled "The Seat I Shouldn't Have Taken." No one knows how many copies it sold, but people say she finally learned to be honest with herself. Thomas Gray, the veteran chief flight attendant, no longer wore Apex's polished uniform. After the scandal, he quietly resigned and accepted a humble job at a small local airline in Denver. There, he wasn't a supervisor anymore, just another crew member, serving coffee, cleaning cabins, and helping elderly passengers with their luggage. To Thomas, that was a form of redemption. He once told a young coworker, "I used to think I was just following the rules. But sometimes rules are just excuses people use to stop thinking. People say that on every flight." Thomas spends a few seconds standing in front of the first row seat 1A, reminding himself, never forget. James Miller, the young flight attendant who first asked Ethan to leave his seat, took a different path. He quit aviation just weeks after the incident. Many assumed he was fired, but in truth, he left on his own. In a short social media post, he wrote, "I thought I was serving justice. Turns out, I was just serving a wrong habit. I don't want to do that for one more day." James went back to college to study behavioral psychology. Years later, he became a speaker at small social awareness forums, where he retold his story not to justify himself, but to remind others that prejudice doesn't need to shout. It only needs silence to survive. Sarah Lee, the young woman in the hoodie from the back of the plane, walked a very different path. After the story went viral, she was flooded with interviews, praise, even hailed as the girl who made justice speak. But Sarah always gave the same humble answer, "I didn't make justice speak. I just turned the mic back on when someone tried to mute it." That honesty caught Ethan Carter's attention. A month later, he sent her an email offering a position at NovaCore Technologies as Director of Tech Ethics and User Advocacy. When she accepted, Ethan told her one simple thing: "I don't need the best person. I need the one who speaks up when everyone else stays silent." At NovaCore, Sarah led an open-source project called Project Equalize, an AI system designed to detect and remove bias from hiring and user evaluation data. She worked alongside engineers, researchers, and social advocates during one presentation of the prototype. She glanced at Ethan sitting quietly in the back of the room, listening intently. She smiled and said, I still keep the ticket from that flight, Apex 247, not to remember the bad day, but to remind myself that sometimes one person pressing record can change the world." Ethan smiled back, and sometimes, he said, justice doesn't need a punch, just a press of the record button. A year later, NovaCore's LinkedIn page posted a message, "From Seat 1A to Project Equalize Justice begins with listening." The post went viral, receiving millions of shares. Among the comments was one signed T.G., perhaps Thomas Gray, who wrote, "I once served him coffee. Now I serve people learning how to respect one another. Thank you, Mr. Carter." As for Ethan Carter, He rarely appeared in public. He avoided the media and never spoke of victory. At a technology ethics conference, when asked about the event, he simply said, "Sometimes, you don't need to defeat anyone. You just need to make sure you don't lose to yourself." And in the end, what people remember isn't Seat 1A, nor the system that froze, but how one man chose silence so powerful. It made the whole world listen. They say every story of justice begins with a wound. But some people refuse to let that wound turn into hatred. They turn it into consequence. Ethan Carter was one of those people. After everything, when Apex Airways systems came back online, and the storm of Mark Seat Cowan A began to fade, someone once asked him, "Don't you hate them?" Ethan. After what they did to you, he simply replied, "If I hated them, I'd become part of the same system that wronged me. But if I let them face their own consequences, the system itself will correct." That wasn't revenge. It was accountability, the moral reaction of a mind that understood its own limits. In this world, revenge is instinct. It satisfies emotion, but rarely heals anything. Consequence, on the other hand, is the reaction of responsibility, quiet, enduring, and transformative. Apex didn't lose $800 million because Ethan wanted to destroy them. He could have terminated every contract, driven them into bankruptcy, but he didn't. He let them see their own flaw and forced them to fix it, not for his pride, but for the thousands of lives that depended on that company. At a deeper level, Ethan's act wasn't just about fairness, it was the clash between emotion and reason, between the impulse to retaliate and the duty to rebuild. He knew that if he let anger lead, the media would get another week of frenzy. Social media would have another hero to praise and then forget. But if he stayed silent and acted with intelligence, the system itself would have to evolve so it would never make the same mistake again. One evening, standing on NovaCore's balcony overlooking the city lights, Sarah Lee asked softly, "Don't you ever feel like they deserve to be punished?" Ethan gazed into the distance, his voice calm as the wind. Justice isn't about making someone hurt the way you did. It's about making them understand why that hurt should never happen again. Sarah fell silent. She understood. That kind of justice didn't make people cheer, it made them think. And that's what made Ethan Carter different. A man who didn't need recognition, only a world a little better for having known him. When the Seat 1A case began appearing in university curriculums, professors of law, philosophy, and technology all quoted one line from Ethan's rare public interview: "Dignity isn't negotiable." That sentence became the motto of a small but growing movement in the tech world, a call for algorithmic ethics. Developers, engineers, and AI researchers began asking new questions about how their creations could either reinforce or dismantle bias. Somewhere out there, Ethan's quiet justice was still at work in lines of code, in boardroom discussions, in the birth of every new ethical policy sparked by that one flight. Ethan himself never mentioned Seat 1A again. In his mind, it wasn't a wound, it was a beginning. He realized that sometimes, instead of breaking a system, the right thing to do is to make it look into its own mirror. An article in The Atlantic summed it up perfectly. Ethan Carter didn't destroy his enemies. He made them live, but live more consciously. In a world full of voices shouting for justice, Ethan chose silence. And that silence carried further than any speech ever could. Because true justice, as he once said, isn't something to prove, it's something to preserve. Looking back, every person in the story, from Lydia Monroe to Victoria Hale, from Thomas Gray to Sarah Lee, had lived through the price of consequence. No one was completely destroyed, but no one could ever live the same way again. And maybe that's the fairest punishment of all, to make people live on with new awareness of who they are. Ethan never called himself a hero. At a closed Harvard symposium, he said quietly, "A hero is someone who knows when to speak and when to stay silent. I just chose silence at the right time." The room rose in applause, but Ethan only smiled and walked away. And perhaps that's why the world calls Ethan Carter the symbol of silent justice. A man who never needed to defeat anyone yet made the whole world redefine what it means to truly win. Time moved on. The headlines about Seat 1A faded, replaced by newer stories and fresher scandals. But some stories don't fade because they're not just news. They are mirrors, reflecting who we are when no one's watching. For Ethan Carter, that day was no longer a wound. It was a reminder. He still worked at NovaCore, still taught, still spoke quietly about ethics and technology. No one talked anymore about the frozen $800 million system, but the movement he'd sparked still lived quietly in the minds of ordinary people doing their small part to make things right. One of them was Sarah Lee. When Ethan was invited to speak at the Global Tech Ethics Summit, he didn't talk about himself. He talked about her. He projected a blurry photo onto the big screen, a girl in a hoodie, hands trembling as she held up her phone. "This," Ethan said, "is the person who made justice speak." He paused, letting the silence fill the hall. She had no power, no title, no fame, but she chose not to stay silent. And sometimes that's how revolutions begin. The auditorium went still. Thousands of people sat in silence, realizing that change doesn't start with power. It starts with one person who sees something wrong and refuses to look away. Sarah was sitting quietly in the back row. She wasn't on the speaker list. She wasn't on stage. When the crowd finally applauded, she lowered her head, her eyes glistening. A middle-aged woman beside her, maybe from a human rights organization, leaned over and whispered, "You're Sarah Lee, aren't you? Thank you for recording that day." Sarah smiled softly. "I just did what anyone could have done. I just didn't look away." And maybe that humility, that quiet courage is what turned her into a symbol for millions of ordinary people who chose to do something extraordinary. That evening, after the conference, Sarah stood by the window of NovaCore's office, watching the city lights shimmer below. Ethan walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't hit record that day, none of this would have happened. But maybe, if you had gotten angry, no one would have listened." Ethan smiled, calm as ever. "You're right, but it was never about who pressed record or who stayed calm. It's about what people chose to do after. No single button can save the world, only small, conscious choices, repeated again and again." Sarah nodded, smiling faintly. Maybe justice doesn't need people to shout. Maybe it just needs someone willing to stand still when everyone else walks away. Months later, NovaCore released a short public awareness film. No celebrities, no corporate branding, just Ethan's calm voice over a black screen. "Revenge is emotion. Consequence is structure. Trathu la kam suk. Kon hi kwala trachniem. Dignity isn't negotiable. Pham Jia Hong the Mac Ka. The screen faded into an image of Sarah sitting in a small room, laptop open, editing code on Project Equalize. A woman's voice followed, "Change doesn't come from great power. It comes from small, deliberate actions made by ordinary people." The video lasted just over 2 minutes, but it spread like wildfire, not because of production or marketing, but because it reminded people of something they'd forgotten, that every one of us has the power to change something if we stop staying silent. A journalist wrote, "Sarah Lee isn't a hero. She's proof that you don't have to be one to do what's right." And then, at the end of a TEDx talk, Ethan delivered his closing words soft, steady, unforgettable. Remember Ethan in seat 18C, the man they underestimated. The person you dismissed today might hold your tomorrow. The audience didn't clap immediately. They just sat in the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. A silence of understanding, of hearts that had just touched something real. When the lights dimmed, Ethan walked off stage. No flowers, no photos. Sarah stood in the back, quietly watching. She knew that what he left behind wasn't fame. It was something far rarer, a moral legacy in an age where humanity could clone intelligence, but still struggled to replicate integrity. At the end of a tribute video released a year later, one final line appeared on screen, simple, yet powerful enough to make anyone stop and think justice isn't the court's business. It begins the moment you choose not to stay silent. Because maybe the world doesn't need more angry heroes. It just needs a few ordinary people brave enough to keep their dignity, even when they're sitting in the back row. Sometimes, life isn't measured by the seat you're given, but by how you respond when you're forced to leave it. The story of Ethan Carter, the black man removed from first class, isn't just a lesson about justice. It's a reminder that dignity is never up for negotiation. He didn't choose anger. He didn't seek revenge. He chose intellect and integrity as his weapons, and that was what made an entire system bow its head. In a society where injustice often hides behind rules and procedures, Ethan teaches us that true change doesn't come from great power, but from small deliberate acts of conscience from someone brave enough to speak up, like Sarah Lee, or someone wise enough to stay silent at the right moment, like Ethan. Because justice isn't noise, it's conviction in silence. So, if today you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, remember this. They can take away your position, but they can never take away your worth. And who knows, maybe you, the one sitting in seat 18C of life, will be the one to change the world. Thank you for listening to this story. If you believe that justice begins with mutual respect, please like, share this video, and subscribe to help us spread stories of ethics, awareness, and the quiet power of compassion. Because sometimes it only takes one person who refuses to stay silent for the world to change.